Chapter 1: The Empty Chair at Baker Street. It was a typically somber London evening, the sort that seemed woven from the very fabric of the city's omnipresent fog and the distant chime of Big Ben. Dr. John H. Watson, late of Her Majesty's Army Medical Department, found himself ensconced within the familiar, comforting chaos of 221B, Baker Street. The gaslight cast long, dancing shadows across the cluttered mantelpiece, illuminating a skull perched precariously atop Holmes's latest scientific journal and the ever-present Persian slipper brimming with pipe tobacco. My esteemed companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, was, as was often his wont, immersed in one of his arcane chemical pursuits. A retort bubbled ominously on the hearth, emitting a pungent, vaguely acrid odor that, even after years of acquaintance, still occasionally made my eyes water. He leaned over it, his hawk-like profile illuminated by the flame, a concentrated frown furrowing his brow, entirely oblivious to the mundane world beyond his immediate experiment. "A fascinating interplay of alkaloids, Watson," he muttered, without looking up, as if continuing a conversation I was not aware had begun. The precise reaction of the aconitum napellus extract with a dilute solution of ferric chloride under controlled atmospheric pressure. It elucidates, rather beautifully, a certain poisoning case I encountered last summer. I merely grunted an acknowledgement, accustomed to his sudden pronouncements. My own evening, I mused, promised a rather less exhilarating, though infinitely more palatable, engagement. A quiet visit to the Criterion for a modest supper, perhaps followed by a contemplative stroll through St. James's Park. Such simple pleasures were a welcome antidote to the intellectual maelstrom that so frequently engulfed our shared abode. "Well, Holmes," I announced, rising from my armchair and reaching for my hat and walking stick, which resided faithfully by the door. "I shall bid you good night. Pray do not blow up the establishment in my absence." He offered a noncommittal wave of a gloved hand, the glove worn to protect against chemical stains, his attention irrevocably fixed upon his apparatus. "Indeed, Watson. Endeavour to avoid any altercations with the nocturnal denizens of London. Your chronicling pen would be of little use from a hospital bed." A faint, dry humour laced his tone, but his gaze never left the bubbling retort. With a final glance at my friend, framed by the theatrical glow of his scientific endeavour, I slipped out into the misty London night, anticipating nothing more than a few hours of tranquil solitude before my customary return. The following morning, I was not, of course, the one to awaken. It was Holmes, a man whose internal clock was rarely dictated by the conventional passage of hours, who found himself stirred by an unusual absence. The familiar clatter of my boots on the stairs, the gentle murmur of my morning ablutions, the faint scent of toast and coffee from the kitchen below, all were conspicuously absent. He emerged from his room, stretching languidly, his mind already contemplating the day's intellectual fare. The sitting room, usually brought to life by my presence and the morning papers, was silent. My armchair stood empty, the cushions unruffled. A quick glance towards the door confirmed his dawning unease. My trusty hat and stout walking stick, habitually left upon the hall stand, were nowhere to be seen. More peculiar still, there was no note, no message, no customary scribbled instruction left on the mantelpiece explaining a sudden departure. Initially, Holmes's keen mind sought the most logical, prosaic explanation. An early call from a patient, perhaps. A sudden fancy to visit an old army colleague. But as the morning wore on, and the silence in the rooms grew heavier, the simple explanations began to fray. He paced the room, his long fingers drumming a restless tattoo upon the window sill. His eyes, now sharpened by an almost paternal concern, swept over the familiar objects. And then, he found them. Not grand revelations, but faint whispers of disturbance. A barely perceptible scuff mark near the threshold, distinct from the usual daily traffic, suggesting a hurried or perhaps forceful movement. And upon a lower shelf, where a tome on tropical diseases usually resided, the dust, usually a uniform blanket, was disturbed in a peculiar, sweeping pattern, as if something had been dragged or hastily brushed aside. The initial dismissiveness, the intellectual aloofness that Holmes often wore as a cloak, began to dissolve, replaced by a cold, calculating certainty. My friend, Dr. John H. Watson, had not simply gone out. He had vanished. And the faint, silent traces left behind suggested a disappearance not of his own choosing. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot, but this time, it carried a far more personal and ominous chill. Chapter 2: A Labyrinth of Shadows. The initial disquiet had solidified into a grim resolve. Sherlock Holmes, shedding the domestic cloak of the absent-minded professor, became the relentless hunter. His keen mind, a veritable engine of deduction, whirred into action, though the object of its pursuit was one of agonizing personal significance. He wasted no time in fruitless speculation. Instead, he launched himself into a meticulous, almost surgical, investigation across the vast, indifferent expanse of London. His first port of call was Scotland Yard, where Inspector Lestrade, perpetually harried, greeted Holmes with a mixture of professional respect and thinly veiled exasperation. Holmes, however, dispensed with pleasantries, delivering a terse, precise account of Watson's disappearance. He requested discreet inquiries, particularly among the cabmen who plied their trade in the Baker Street vicinity and the constables whose beats encompassed Watson's usual haunts. No official fuss, no unnecessary alarm, merely an extensive, silent dragnet. Next, Holmes plunged into his own extensive network of contacts, a subterranean world of informants whose ears were pressed perpetually to the city's underbelly. Dirty-faced urchins, known to him as the Baker Street Irregulars, were dispatched with specific instructions to inquire about any unusual carriages, any strange disturbances, any unfamiliar faces seen loitering near 221B the previous night. He questioned street sweepers, news vendors, even the local pawnbroker, a man whose encyclopedic knowledge of local gossip often rivaled his own. He retraced Watson's probable footsteps from the previous evening. The Doctors' Club, the Criterion, yielded nothing beyond the confirmation that he had not dined there. The chemist's shop, where Watson often purchased medicinal sundries, reported no visit. The small, carefully manicured park where my friend frequently took his constitutional provided no more than a few dropped handkerchiefs and the mundane scuffs of everyday foot traffic. Each lead, meticulously followed, proved cold, dissipating like smoke in the damp London air. The bustling metropolis, with its ceaseless ebb and flow of humanity, seemed to have swallowed Dr. Watson whole, leaving not a single tangible trace behind. Hours bled into days. Holmes, usually a paragon of stoic detachment, displayed a rare, almost visible, frustration. His deductions, ordinarily as precise and unyielding as a mathematical equation, faltered in the face of such a complete absence of data. There was no struggle indicated, no ransom note, no witness, nothing but the gnawing void of absence. He worked through the nights, fueled by strong tea and a deepening worry, his violin lying untouched, his pipe cold in the ashtray. Returning to Baker Street after yet another fruitless foray into the city's labyrinthine streets, the familiar rooms felt desolate, unnervingly quiet. My armchair stood perpetually empty, a silent sentinel to a missing presence. The faint, lingering scent of my pipe tobacco, usually a comforting aroma, now merely underscored the emptiness. Even Mrs. Hudson, sensing the unspoken tension, moved about with a subdued quietude, her usual cheerful bustle replaced by a concerned hush. Holmes stood by the window, gazing out at the perpetual grey of London, his hands clasped behind his back. The case was unlike any he had encountered. It was personal, devoid of the intellectual detachment he usually cultivated. Watson was not merely a client or a source of stimulating challenges, he was the anchor to Holmes's own humanity, the loyal Boswell who faithfully recorded his triumphs and tolerated his eccentricities. To have him vanish, without a whisper of a clue, was a torment of the most profound kind. The usually infallible Sherlock Holmes was adrift in conjecture. Chapter 3: The Young Eyewitness. The relentless search had yielded nothing but the bitter taste of urban indifference. Days had slipped into a frustrating procession of dead ends and unanswered questions. Inspector Lestrade, though diligently pursuing Holmes's subtle directives, had found no trace. The irregulars, usually so adept at sifting through the dregs of London's underbelly, had returned with reports as barren as a winter's field. The sheer absence of evidence, the utter vacuum where Watson should have been, was, for Holmes, a torment far worse than any tangible obstruction. Driven by an almost desperate, visceral urge, Holmes found himself gravitating once more to the small, unassuming park near Watson's preferred promenade, the very spot he had initially dismissed as offering no insight. The green expanse, though manicured and seemingly innocuous, held a faint, almost imperceptible echo of Watson's regular presence. He settled upon a secluded bench, his gaunt frame a stark silhouette against the fading afternoon light, observing the mundane comings and goings of nurses with prams and elderly gentlemen with their newspapers. His gaze was not idle, it was an intensity that bordered on despair, a fervent hope that some forgotten detail, some overlooked anomaly, might present itself from the very air. His mind, usually a finely tuned instrument of logic, felt frayed at the edges. The customary detachment, the intellectual distance he maintained from his cases, had been irrevocably shattered. This was not a puzzle to be solved for its own sake, this was John. He had been seated thus for perhaps an hour, his eyes scanning the paths and shrubbery with an almost unnatural focus, when a small, hesitant figure approached him. It was a girl, no older than 10, perhaps, her fair hair escaping from beneath a simple bonnet, a well-loved wooden doll clutched in her small hand. She looked up at him with wide, curious eyes, her innocence a stark contrast to the grim tableau within Holmes's mind. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice a reedy whisper, yet clear enough in the quiet park. "You are the tall gentleman who always walks with the other gentleman, aren't you?" She paused, twisting the doll's wooden arm nervously. "The kind gentleman who gave me a shilling once for finding his dropped glove near the fountain." A flicker of recognition, faint but distinct, passed across Holmes's features. He recalled a minor incident months prior, a small act of kindness Watson had performed, barely meriting a footnote in his own mental catalogue. He nodded slowly, a slight inclination of his head. "Indeed, child. You speak of Dr. Watson." The girl's brow furrowed, her gaze fixed on Holmes with an earnestness that pierced through his preoccupation. "Yes, sir, Dr. Watson." "Is he quite well?" He seemed not quite himself the other evening. The one with the bleeding nose and the cut upon his head. The word struck Holmes with the force of a physical blow. The air seemed to condense around him, the park's mundane sounds receding into a distant hum. A bleeding nose. A cut upon his head. This was not a pleasant stroll. This was not a casual outing. "Pray tell me, child," Holmes said, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the sudden hammering of his heart, "what precisely did you see? When was this?" The girl, encouraged by his directness, tightened her grip on her doll. "It was, I think it was 2 nights ago, just as the gas lamps were being lit. I was playing hide-and-seek near the old oak, and I saw him being helped by 3 very big men. He looked so pale, and his nose was bleeding, and there was a little cut just here." She pointed to her own forehead. "I asked if he was all right, because he looked very poorly indeed. But one of the men, he was very gruff, just said, 'He's fine, little miss, just a bit clumsy, took a fall.'" Chapter 4: The Livery of the Serpent. The child's innocent words had ignited a cold fire in Holmes's usually placid eyes. The despair that had gnawed at him for days was suddenly transmuted into an almost terrifying intensity. He bent lower, placing a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, his voice now devoid of any hint of his previous weariness, imbued instead with a quiet urgency that held her captivated. "My dear," he began, his tone surprisingly soft, "your observation is of the utmost importance. Could you tell me anything more about the men? Were they tall or short? Did they speak with any accent? And this carriage, were there any markings upon it, a crest or a symbol, beyond the colors?" The girl, sensing the gravity in his voice, concentrated with the earnestness only a child can summon. "One was very tall, sir, with a scar here," she touched her own cheek. "And another had a very loud voice, but they didn't really talk much, only to tell me Dr. Watson was fine. The carriage, it didn't have a crest that I saw, but the red stripes, they were very sharp, like lightning bolts. And the wheels were like blood against the dark wood." She shivered slightly at her own description. Holmes nodded slowly, absorbing every detail. "You have been most helpful, my dear," he said, producing a gleaming silver shilling from his waistcoat pocket and pressing it into her hand. "This is for your keen eyes and your honest tongue. Now, run along, and tell no one what we have spoken of, for it is a secret of great import." The girl, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and delight, clutched her coin and her doll, curtsying before skipping away, a vital, unwitting cog in the machinery of justice. The moment she was out of earshot, Holmes was on his feet, his languor shed as if it were a discarded cloak. "Red and black," he muttered to himself, striding purposefully from the park. "A livery, most assuredly. Not a common conveyance, but a bespoke equipage, designed to strike a certain impression, to announce a particular affiliation." His mind, now a finely tuned instrument, raced through the annals of his vast mental library concerning London's criminal underworld. He knew the markings, the colours, the subtle distinctions that often identified the various factions and gangs that operated beneath the city's veneer of respectability. Common hackneys were drab, their owners too transient for such ostentation. This carriage spoke of permanence, of an established order, however unsavoury. His path led him directly to the grimy, labyrinthine streets of the East End, a place where gas lamps burned dimmer and the shadows clung more tenaciously. Here, amidst the bustling docks and the crowded rookeries, lay a different kind of commerce, a constant exchange of information, often illicit. He visited stables known for their discreet dealings, spoke to carriage makers who specialized in private commissions, and passed cryptic messages through the network of urchins he had earlier deployed. The name that began to surface, whispered in hushed tones, was that of Old Scratch. A man whom Holmes had, years ago, helped to reform from a life of petty crime. Old Scratch now ran a seemingly legitimate antique shop in a forgotten alley. Yet his ears remained firmly pressed to the ground, and his memory was as sharp as the shards of porcelain in his dusty display cases. Holmes found him amidst a cacophony of grandfather clocks and tarnished silver. "Scratch," Holmes stated, foregoing any preliminary pleasantries, "I seek information concerning a particular livery. Red and black, with sharp, almost lightning-like stripes. Used on a carriage capable of rapid movement, carrying 3 men and a 4th, unwilling passenger. Seen 2 nights past." Old Scratch's eyes, like 2 dark beads, darted around the shop before settling on Holmes. He wiped his grimy hands on his apron. Chapter 5: Echoes of an Old Score. The name, Elias Croft, reverberated in Holmes's mind, stirring a memory that, while several years old, had lost none of its chilling clarity. It was a name etched not merely in the records of Scotland Yard, but in the very fabric of London's criminal annals. Croft, a man of ruthless ambition and cold cunning, had once presided over the Serpents, a gang notorious for its audacity and the almost theatrical precision of its operations. Jewel robberies of immense value, meticulously planned extortions that preyed upon the city's affluent, and a network of clandestine gambling dens, these were the hallmarks of Croft's reign. It had been one of Holmes's more protracted and intricate cases, demanding weeks of relentless investigation, countless hours spent sifting through cryptic messages and observing the shadowy movements of Croft's lieutenants. The man had possessed a mind, twisted though it was, that commanded a grudging respect from Holmes, for its sheer ingenuity in devising and executing his elaborate schemes. But ingenuity, when applied to wickedness, merely made the fall the harder. Holmes had meticulously unravelled Croft's intricate web of deceit, tightening the threads of evidence until the entire, glittering edifice collapsed. The outcome had been inevitable, a lengthy sentence, years spent behind the cold, grey walls of a penitentiary. Now, as Old Scratch spoke of the red and black carriage and the resurgence of the Serpents, the pieces of the macabre puzzle clicked into place with an almost audible, sickening certainty. The motive for Watson's abduction, once a bewildering void, became chillingly, terrifyingly clear. This was not a simple kidnapping for ransom, nor a random act of violence. This was a calculated, long-simmering act of revenge, patiently nurtured through years of imprisonment, now unleashed against the man who had brought down Croft's empire. And in a cruel twist of fate, Watson, Holmes's truest friend and most loyal companion, had been chosen as the unwitting pawn in this wicked game. A cold rage, rare and potent, flickered in Holmes's breast. To use Watson, the steadfast, the honourable, the gentle heart of Baker Street, as a mere instrument of vengeance against him, was an affront that stirred a deeper wrath than any direct threat to his own person. It was a personal declaration of war, and Holmes was more than prepared to accept the challenge. His mind, now burning with renewed vigour, turned to strategy. Croft, upon release, would not linger in London, the scene of his former downfall. He would seek new hunting grounds, a place where his old reputation might not precede him, where the long arm of the London constabulary would stretch thin. Holmes considered the great industrial cities of England, places where a new face could easily blend into the throngs of migrant workers, where anonymity was a cloak easily donned. Bristol, with its bustling docks? Birmingham, with its workshops and factories? No. Holmes dismissed them. Croft, a man of large ambitions, would seek a stage commensurate with his inflated ego, a city undergoing a boom, yet still possessing the dark, forgotten corners where illicit enterprises could thrive. His geographical knowledge of Great Britain, encyclopedic as it was, now became his most vital tool. He considered population growth, industrial expansion, and the relative effectiveness of local police forces. Manchester, Holmes finally declared, the single word hanging in the air like a pronouncement. The textile mills, the burgeoning wealth, the sheer sprawl of it, an ideal environment for a new criminal enterprise to take root, far enough to evade immediate London pursuit, yet with ample opportunities for nefarious dealings. It was a city of perpetual expansion, a roaring engine of industry and population, a perfect labyrinth for a man like Croft to disappear into, and perhaps, to rebuild his broken empire. The destination was set. Holmes, without a moment's hesitation, made arrangements for the swiftest possible passage. He left a cryptic, reassuring message for Mrs. Hudson, instructing her to maintain the illusion of his and Watson's immediate return, and armed himself not only with his revolver but with a grim determination. The clock was ticking, and John Watson was in the hands of a man consumed by a vengeful past. Chapter 6: The Northern Pursuit. The express to Manchester, a mechanical marvel of steam and iron, tore through the British countryside with a speed that belied its massive bulk. For Sherlock Holmes, however, the journey felt interminably slow. Each mile that separated him from London also separated him from Watson, and the gnawing anxiety was a constant, unwelcome passenger. He had foregone sleep, spending the hours hunched over maps, his long fingers tracing the railway lines, memorizing the industrial landscape that unfolded before him on the charts. Upon his arrival, Manchester presented a stark contrast to the familiar, gaslit elegance of London. The air itself seemed different, thick with the pervasive scent of coal smoke and damp wool, the sky a perpetual, sooty grey. The incessant clatter of looms and the shriek of factory whistles replaced the distant cries of street vendors and the clop of hooves on cobbled streets. It was a city in the throes of relentless industry, its architecture a utilitarian blend of red brick and blackened stone, built for function rather than grace. Holmes, stepping out of the bustling station, felt the immediate disorienting effect of a new environment. Yet, this very unfamiliarity was a challenge he embraced. He moved with a quiet purpose through the teeming thoroughfares, his deerstalker pulled low, his keen eyes absorbing every nuance. He noted the local dialects, harsher and more clipped than those in the South, the subtle differences in dress and demeanor, the peculiar rhythm of a city driven by the relentless pulse of its mills. His initial inquiries were conducted with characteristic discretion. He sought out the local constabulary, introducing himself with a carefully constructed, somewhat vague narrative concerning a missing gentleman who might have traveled north on business. He learned quickly that Manchester, for all its booming prosperity, possessed its own thriving underworld, often distinct from London's, yet sometimes interconnected by threads of illicit trade. His method, however, was not to rely solely on official channels. He knew that the serpents under Croft would not advertise their presence. Instead, he sought the faint, almost imperceptible disturbances they would inevitably create. He haunted the docks, where goods, both legal and contraband, flowed in and out. He frequented the less reputable public houses, where rumor and illicit intelligence flowed as freely as ale. He observed the faces, the postures, the subtle interactions that bespoke of membership in a certain fraternity. It was in a particularly smoke-filled tavern, tucked away down a narrow alley known as Smuggler's Reach, that Holmes's acute observational skills bore fruit. He spotted a man with a distinctive gait, a peculiar twitch of the left eye, and a scar above his brow, a man who had once been a minor associate of Croft's in London, a hanger-on to the Serpents. The man, clearly believing himself to be anonymous in this northern city, was engaged in a hushed, furtive conversation with two other rough-looking individuals. Holmes shadowed them patiently through the maze of back streets, past towering warehouses and derelict factories, until they reached the industrial outskirts of the city. Here, amidst a wasteland of abandoned structures, stood a vast, dilapidated textile mill. Its windows were mostly broken, its brickwork crumbling, and its massive chimney stood like a skeletal finger against the perpetually overcast sky. Rusting machinery lay half-buried in the overgrown yard, and a single, heavy gate, secured by a formidable chain, offered the only entrance. The air around it hung heavy with the stench of decay and disuse, yet Holmes's preternaturally sharp senses detected something else, the faintest trace of coal smoke from a recently stoked fire, a subtle tremor in the ground that bespoke of recent heavy foot traffic, and a barely discernible, metallic clang from within its cavernous depths. It was too isolated, too desolate, too perfectly suited to concealment. A place known for its isolation and shadowy dealings, a refuge far from prying eyes. This, Holmes knew with an unshakable certainty, was it. The Serpent's new lair. And within its dark, gaping maw, he hoped, lay his friend, Dr. John H. Watson. The northern pursuit had ended, and the confrontation was about to begin. Chapter 7: A Fistful of Justice. The Manchester fog, thick and oily, clung to the derelict mill like a shroud. It swirled around Sherlock Holmes as he approached the grim edifice, lending an ethereal, almost spectral quality to the crumbling brick and shattered windows. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thrum of the city's industry and the unnervingly loud crunch of his own boots on the gravel. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, a shadow among shadows, his senses heightened, every nerve end screaming with anticipation. Infiltrating the mill proved less challenging than he had anticipated. A section of the perimeter wall, weakened by years of neglect, offered a discreet entry point. Inside, the air was a noxious blend of damp earth, industrial decay, and the faint, unsettling scent of unwashed men. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of moonlight that pierced the grime-coated windows, illuminating skeletal machinery and vast, echoing spaces. Holmes navigated the labyrinthine interior, his footsteps muffled, his eyes accustomed to the gloom. He descended a rickety staircase, his hand never leaving the comforting weight of his service revolver, though he hoped its use would not be necessary. His deductions led him to a small, enclosed office-like structure within the larger cavern of the mill, distinguishable by a single, feebly burning oil lamp that cast a flickering, jaundiced glow. He paused, listening. A low groan, undeniably Watson's, reached him. It was a sound of pain, but also of life. A surge of relief, potent and almost overwhelming, coursed through him, quickly followed by a renewed surge of cold fury. With a swift, silent movement, Holmes slipped through the partially open door. There, illuminated by the struggling lamplight, was Dr. John H. Watson. He was slumped in a chair, pale and visibly bruised, his hands bound roughly behind his back, a gag around his mouth. A nasty cut marred his forehead, and his nose showed signs of a recent, violent impact. Yet, his eyes, though clouded with pain and exhaustion, still held their familiar spark of stubborn resilience. "Watson," Holmes whispered, taking a step forward. "A touching reunion, Mr. Holmes," a voice drawled from the deeper shadows of the room, a voice thick with menace and cold satisfaction. Elias Croft emerged, a hulking figure framed by the doorway, his features shadowed, but the gleam in his eyes unmistakable. He was older, certainly, his face etched with the bitterness of his imprisonment, but his presence was still commanding, still radiating a palpable sense of ruthless power. Behind him, two other men, burly and unkempt, stood silently, their expressions hostile. "I had almost despaired of your arrival," Croft continued, stepping into the lamplight. "Though I knew you would come. The bait was, after all, irresistible. And now, you will finally understand the true cost of meddling in the affairs of Elias Croft." He gestured towards Watson with a cruel smile. "Your good doctor here has been most informative. A man of principle, it seems. And rather resilient." Holmes's jaw tightened. "Your thirst for vengeance blinds you, Croft. You have underestimated the bond between friends. And you have grossly overestimated your own acumen." Croft merely chuckled, a dry, grating sound. "Bold words, detective. But words will not save you now. My men will ensure you join your friend in a rather more permanent state of repose." He nodded to his thugs. The two men advanced, one wielding a heavy iron bar, the other a length of knotted rope. Holmes, despite his slender build, was no stranger to physical confrontation. He had often used his knowledge of anatomy and pugilistic science in past encounters, but this time, the stakes were profoundly personal. His movements were swift, almost fluid. The first thug lunged with the iron bar. Holmes sidestepped with a dancer's grace, allowing the bar to whistle harmlessly past his ear. As the man stumbled, Holmes's right fist, propelled by surprising force, connected sharply with the point of his jaw. There was a sickening thud, and the thug crumpled, unconscious, to the grimy floor. The second man, enraged, roared and swung the rope, aiming for Holmes's head. Holmes ducked beneath it, and as the rope whistled overhead, he pivoted, driving his knee sharply into the man's midsection. The thug gasped, doubling over, and Holmes followed with a short, brutal chop to the back of the neck. The man sagged, clutching his belly, dazed and momentarily incapacitated. Croft stared, his cruel smile faltering, surprised by the ferocity and efficiency of Holmes's defense. "You fight well, for a bookworm," he snarled, a new glint of respect in his eyes. He motioned to the third thug, a mountainous brute who had been standing guard. "Finish him, then." This last man was bigger, slower, but possessed of an animalistic strength. He lumbered forward, aiming a powerful, club-like fist. Holmes knew a direct exchange would be folly. He feinted left, drawing the man's attention, then darted right, slipping past his guard. With a burst of speed, Holmes delivered a series of rapid, precise blows, a jab to the nose, a quick strike to the ear, and finally, a devastating kick to the knee that sent the giant sprawling with a cry of pain. Holmes stood panting slightly, his knuckles bruised, but his eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fire. Watson, struggling against his bonds, watched with a mixture of terror and fierce pride. The great detective, usually relying on intellect, had proven himself capable of a raw, physical justice when his friend's life hung in the balance. Croft, now alone amidst his fallen men, watched with a dawning realization that his carefully orchestrated revenge had just begun to unravel. Chapter 8: The Resolution at Dawn. With the last of Croft's henchmen groaning on the floor, Sherlock Holmes wasted no time. He moved to Watson, his movement swift and sure, the blade of his pocket knife severing the rough ropes that bound my wrists. My hands, numb and chafed, were finally free. As the gag was removed, I gulped in the stale air, a wave of dizziness washing over me, but the sight of Holmes's familiar, determined face was the only tonic I required. "Are you well enough to stand, old friend?" Holmes asked, his voice laced with an unusual tenderness. "Bruised, Holmes, and thoroughly disgusted," I replied, forcing a weak smile, "but otherwise, quite sound. A timely arrival, as ever." I pushed myself upright, testing my legs, which protested with a dull ache. My head throbbed, but the surge of adrenaline was a powerful anesthetic. Elias Croft, seeing his plan dissolve into chaos, his men incapacitated, cursed under his breath. The cunning gleam returned to his eyes, momentarily replacing his earlier shock. He would not surrender easily. With a sudden, desperate movement, he darted towards a heavy steel door at the far end of the room, clearly an escape route he had intended for himself. But Holmes, ever anticipating, was a step ahead. He sprang forward, cutting off Croft's path. A brief, vicious struggle ensued, a tangle of limbs and grunts. Croft, driven by the desperation of a cornered animal, fought with unexpected ferocity, but Holmes, despite his lean physique, possessed a surprising strength and agility honed by years of self-defense and meticulous observation of human anatomy. He managed to twist Croft's arm, forcing him against a heavy, cold pillar, effectively pinning him. "Your game is over, Croft," Holmes stated, his voice cold and hard, "and you have lost." Just then, the piercing, unmistakable wail of police sirens shattered the pre-dawn quiet, growing louder with each passing second. The sound echoed through the vast, empty spaces of the mill, a triumphant symphony to my ears. Holmes, always one step ahead, had not left the crucial detail of official reinforcement to chance. Before infiltrating the mill, he had dispatched a telegram, as cryptic as ever, to a trusted contact within the Manchester Constabulary, hinting at a major criminal apprehension and giving a precise location. Within minutes, heavy boots clattered into the mill, and the harsh glare of bullseye lanterns cut through the gloom. Inspector Davies, a stout, no-nonsense officer from the Manchester force, burst in, followed by a contingent of constables. He took in the scene, the battered henchman, the dishevelled Croft held firmly by Holmes, and my own bruised form, with a mixture of surprise and professional satisfaction. "Mr. Holmes," Davies exclaimed, his voice gruff but respectful, "your telegram was indeed illuminating." "Elias Croft, I presume?" "We've had our eye on him since whispers of the serpents began to surface again." "You've saved us a considerable amount of trouble." Croft and his remaining men were swiftly apprehended, their futile protests lost in the clatter of handcuffs. I was attended to by one of the constables, who offered a flask of brandy and a somewhat rough and ready bandage for my head. Though still shaken, the relief of safety and the warmth of the brandy were immensely comforting. The return journey to Baker Street, a day later, was a far cry from the hurried, anxious chase to Manchester. The compartment was silent for much of the way, a silence not of tension, but of profound relief and unspoken understanding between two old friends. Holmes gazed out of the window, his mind already dissecting the case, perhaps considering the next puzzle. "A most unpleasant affair, Holmes," I remarked eventually, breaking the quiet. "And rather personal for you, I imagine." He turned, a rare, almost imperceptible softening in his grey eyes. "Indeed, Watson. To see you in such a state, it was intolerable. A man's judgment, even mine, can be clouded when those closest to him are imperiled." He paused. And to think, the crucial piece of the puzzle lay in the innocent observation of a child. It is a testament, my dear Watson, to the unexpected sources from which truth may emerge. As the train pulled into the familiar platform of Euston Station, the gaslights of London shimmered through the evening mist. We returned to 221B, Baker Street, the rooms once again filled with the comforting echoes of our shared lives. Holmes retreated to his violin, his long, artistic fingers drawing melancholic notes from the strings, a silent reflection on the recent harrowing adventure. I, Dr. John H. Watson, sat down at my desk, the glow of the gas lamp illuminating a fresh sheet of paper. My hand, though still a little unsteady, reached for my pen. The events of the past few days, the fear, the pursuit, the raw struggle in the Manchester mill, were already coalescing into narrative form. I dipped my pen into the inkwell, a familiar ritual, and began to sketch the details of this latest and most personal of adventures. The case of Watson's kidnapping, I mused, the title already forming in my mind. It would serve as a vivid reminder of Holmes's intellect, his surprising physical prowess, and the enduring strength of our singular friendship.